Imagine it's been a long day at work, you come home and you pick up the newest fantasy book. It is named A Crown of Stars and Shadows, or Kingdom of Burning Roses. There's a sword and a crown and some flower petals on the cover. It has a badass female main character named Eowyn Elvenheart. And she is tasked to kill the prince of an enemy kingdom. His name is Kai, with an X. And before you know it, you are reading long descriptions of Kai's muscular back. And half the battles in this book are just Kai's and Eowyn's tongues battling for dominance. You, my friend, are reading a romantasy book. But what is up with this new genre? Where did it suddenly come from? And why is it so popular? Is all fantasy just romance and smut now? So I am coming into this as a romantasy skeptic. I've read my fair share of very popular BookTok romantasy books, and I'm just like, there weren't many that I liked, to be honest. But I love fantasy and I also love romance, so I am very fascinated by the romantasy trend. And the genre gets a lot of hate, especially from like general fantasy fans, so I just wanted to get into this topic with like genuine curiosity. So romantasy, which is a portmanteau of romance and fantasy, is a kind of new genre that has been seeing huge popularity in the past 1-2 years. It's a fantasy book like any other, but the romance plays a big role amidst all the sword fighting and questing. I would say generally compared to normal fantasy books, romantasy has a little bit less focus on the world building and a little bit more focus on specifically the main character and usually her love interest. There's more focus on the relationship development and the character development. But if we compare it to traditional romance, I actually really agree with what Eli Cucini wrote for Dazed. More typical romances tend to value lightness, escapism, and pleasurable predictability. Romantasy values danger, twists, and immersion, and uses violence, or the threat of it, to build some sexual tension. Adjebola Roberts, editor at HarperCollins, tells The Guardian, romance readers have discovered that romantasy has all the tropes that they adore, but set in a world they can escape to and get lost in. So because of the fantasy element, I would say that romantasy just has a level of escapism that normal romance, like contemporary romance, just doesn't have. Also, enemies to lovers is like famously a very, very popular genre, and you just can't really fully do the enemies to lovers thing in a modern world setting. Like, it's just more interesting if it's really like we are rivaling clans that have murdered each other's family. There's just more tension there than just I guess we're rivals in the office. The most notable titles are A Court of Thorns and Roses, starring very attractive Fae, and Fourth Wing, which is a dragon fantasy with a very strong enemies to lovers plotline. If you look at the Google Trends for romantasy and romantasy books, you can see that the searches for it have skyrocketed the past year. The hashtag romantasy on TikTok has more than 400,000 videos under it, so that's not views, that is like people that are making videos about this topic. 400,000. So there's a clear community around this genre. And in 2023, the Goodreads Choice Awards added a category for the romantasy genre. Again, signaling that this genre has suddenly become really, really big, that it warrants its own section. And many publishers have also launched romantasy imprints in the wake of the genre's popularity. Sarah Wendell explains in the Washinton Post, it is one of the fastest growing genres according to market researcher Circana, with sales increasing by 42% from 2022 to 2023. So romantasy isn't just like a cute new genre, it is like a powerhouse in publishing right now. Also getting millions of people into reading again, as you can see on BookTok. If you really like romantasy books, like maybe you read ACOTAR or Fourth Wing, you are really going to like the sponsor of today's video, which is Tapas. Their best-selling novel, I Made a Deal with the Devil by Cousin Alex, is a mix between paranormal and romance, so also a romantasy. And it's the concept of the story that really got me. We follow Evangeline Young, who is betrayed by her family. Her partner cheats on her. She gets fired from her family company. So she makes a deal with the devil to get back at her family's company. She says, "I will do anything to get back at them. I want them to feel the pain of losing something they treasure so much. And this is only the beginning. I intend to fully pay them back for their wonderful care of me with added interest." I support women's rights, but I also support women's wrongs. I just love these kind of revenge stories. And like literally everyone else, I'm just a sucker for stories where the love interest is some kind of dark devil type, especially if they make a deal together. And because they make a deal, they have a whole contract where they very clearly establish consent about everything. So even when the story gets a little bit spicy, it always remains very safe. And we love that on this channel. You can read I Made a Deal with the Devil on Tapas. Tapas is a web novel app full of serialized web novels that are fun and easy to read, and every week new chapters will come out. A lot of them are also illustrated, and I just really like that on this app you get the chance to discover all sorts of stories and writing made by authors that just want to share what they've made online, and they get to do that on Tapas. They also have an app, so you can always very conveniently read anywhere you are. And here's the best part. The first 100 people to use my code BOOKLEO will unlock 30 additional chapters for free of I Made a Deal with the Devil. So click the link in my description and use my code. Let's start by trying to answer the question, what is romantasy? I know I just talked about it and gave you a definition, but people don't know what romantasy is. Like, people just can't agree on it. You would think, well, it's romance and then fantasy, and then you put them together, and that's romantasy. But how much romance can a fantasy have before it becomes a romantasy? I was looking at this article that was titled, "Dragons and Sex Are Now a 610 Million Business Sweeping Publishing." And the author, Eli Ceron, is talking about Fourth Wing, which is like a huge romantasy book about dragon riders. But honestly, when I saw this article title, I was like, this could be about Game of Thrones. Let's be honest, this could be about Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is also very much known for having a lot of sex in it, and it has like romantic plot lines, but no one's going to call Game of Thrones a romantasy, obviously. So where is the line? The other day I was going to an English bookstore and they had a shelf dedicated to romantasy. I was just fascinated to kind of see which books they categorized as romantasy and which they didn't. And I just found a lot of books that did have very strong romantic plot lines still in the fantasy section, not in the romantasy section. So again, it just made me wonder, at what point is something romantasy? At what point is a fantasy book romantic enough that it can be called romantasy? The Washinton Post defines romantasy as being romance first, thereby differentiating it from romantic fantasy. In romantasy, without the romance, the book falls apart. But I've also seen people refer to basically any fantasy book that has a romantic plotline as a romantasy, especially if it's written by a woman. Let's look at two books that I've seen recommended very often in those like romantasy book lists. So we have Divine Rivals. Divine Rivals is a young adult fantasy romance book about two rivaling magical journalists that unknowingly write letters to each other through a magical typewriter. It is a novel about finding love in times of war and uncertainty. And the whole concept of the book with the magical typewriter surrounds the romance between these two journalists. But then we have The Cruel Prince, which I actually have right here. I've seen this recommended as romantasy as well, when this is mainly like political intrigue about Fae, and then it also happens to have an enemies to lovers romance in there, in the background, kind of. Like, takes a few books, you know? So no one really seems to agree on what constitutes a romantasy book. And I feel like people lately, especially publishers, just kind of put the label on anything so that the book can appeal to fans of the massively popular A Court of Thorns and Roses or Fourth Wing. I would say that at its core, romantasy is more just a marketing term to sell books. Because here's the thing, the concept of a romantasy isn't new at all. Like, the concept of fantasy books that have very strong romantic plot lines, that's been around. Like many things that we see on TikTok, it's actually been around for a lot longer than it has been popular on TikTok. So I read this article in The Conversation by two academics in literature, Jodi McAlister and Kate Cuthbert, and they give some examples of older books that are also kind of 50-50 on fantasy and romance. And Rice did it in the 1970s with Interview with the Vampire. In 1967, there was a book series called The Dragon Riders of Pern, where dragon riders would fall in love the way that their dragons did. In the 90s, although like paranormal romances, the Suki Stackhouse series were very romantic. And you could even argue that the paranormal romance trend in the 2010s in young adult fiction was romantasy. Like Twilight and all of its clones, Shatter Me, The Mortal Instruments, they were all pretty romantic. Romantasy, therefore, is not new, but the term is, and I think this is so important to realize. I think with the huge popularity, especially of Fourth Wing last year, there were just a lot of people who were kind of new into reading. Like, I didn't like Fourth Wing, but I do appreciate it for getting so many people excited about a book that it got like a 4.5 or something average rating on Goodreads. That's huge. And now you have all these people that read Fourth Wing and were like, oh my god, I actually really like reading. What else is there? And then everyone's like, A Court of Thorns and Roses. And they all read A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is also huge. But then what's next, you know? You can't just tell these people, oh, read fantasy books, because that's not like specifically the little flavor that A Court of Thorns and Roses and Fourth Wing has. With its also combination with that enemies to lovers, a bit of spice, a bit of romance. So now we have the term romantasy for that. And I've noticed a lot of best romantasy books to read lists tend to be made specifically to like quote unquote fill the void after A Court of Thorns and Roses. A Court of Thorns and Roses is actually especially a great example of how book genres are often more just marketing terms. So I just want to take a little deep dive into A Court of Thorns and Roses. Sarah J. Maas, the author of A Court of Thorns and Roses, is the romantasy author. Her novels have sold over 38 million copies worldwide. Bloomsbury, her publisher, has had their best profit last year in the past 37 years. And a big part of their growing consumer revenue has been accredited to the increased demand for fantasy books, especially Sarah J. Maas's fantasy books. Sarah J. Maas is the author not only of A Court of Thorns and Roses, but also of her Throne of Glass series, which is a young adult high fantasy series, and her Crescent City series, which is an adult urban fantasy series. I've read a few of her books, and I find that her books tend to be this combination of a badass and extremely attractive woman navigating the perils of a Lord of the Rings inspired fantasy world, and then also a simmering romance. Typical Sarah J. Maas romances involve a lot of apex predator metaphors and alpha male metaphors, and also lots of growling. There's a lot of emphasis on males and females, and almost all of her books involve some kind of like soulmate bonding. But by far her most popular series is A Court of Thorns and Roses, which actually came out in 2015. I still vividly remember when this book was published. And when it was originally published, it was not published as a romantasy book because we didn't have the term yet. Actually, quite surprisingly, it was marketed as a young adult fantasy book, and a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Let me give you some context as someone who was very online in the book community in that time. So in 2015, Sarah J. Maas was mostly known for Throne of Glass, her first series, which was a young adult high fantasy series. And in this time, a big trend in fantasy was fairy tale retelling. So almost every fantasy book that came out was a Cinderella retelling or a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Sarah J. Maas herself, when she wrote A Court of Thorns and Roses, was inspired by folklore, specifically Beauty and the Beast, The Legend of Tam Lin, and East of the Sun, West of the Moon. And this book was marketed as a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which makes sense because that was really popular back then. And most controversially, it was marketed as young adult fantasy, which kind of makes sense since she was mostly known for her young adult series Throne of Glass. So it makes sense that the publishers wanted to market A Court of Thorns and Roses to the same audience. And fairy tale retellings were also very popular among young adult audiences. So if you have a Beauty and the Beast retelling, it makes sense you want to market that towards a young adult audience. But the thing about A Court of Thorns and Roses is that it was pretty adult. Not only was it quite violent, I have vivid memories of a scene where like a bone pops out of the main character's leg. And of course, it's known to be quite, just a little smutty. Not that much, but it is a little smutty. It definitely has sexual content. And those things together made a lot of people feel like this is just not a young adult book. This is an adult book and it should be on the adult fantasy shelf. Especially from the second book on, the books just get progressively spicier. This shows that young adult fantasy was, just like Romantasy, more of like a marketing label rather than a real demographic label. There was a specific audience for young adult fantasy books that was just different from the audience of adult fantasy books. And the difference wasn't just age. There were many adults that massively preferred young adult fantasy. And I remember kind of the general consensus at the time, the general idea at the time was that people wanted to read more adult fantasy, but the adult fantasy just didn't really hit the same as the young adult fantasy. Like, they were very different. Like in 2015, adult fantasy was, oh, it's really starting to rain suddenly. Anyway, in 2015, adult fantasy was more epic fantasy. It was Brandon Sanderson, N.K. Jemisin, V.E. Schwab, Jim Butcher. These really big world-building quest stories. It was quite different from the customs in young adult fantasy, like stories that were pretty heavy on romance and followed a single female main character. It's very focused on the thoughts and ideas of the main character and being in their head, whereas adult fantasy tended to be more like epic, grand scheme kind of stories. These young adult stories were a little bit less heavy on the world building and a little more focused on the romance, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And these things really set young adult fantasy apart from adult fantasy in this time. Again, it wasn't just about age. They really were just fundamentally different types of stories. Add to that the fact that epic fantasy for a very long time was kind of a boys' club, whereas YA fantasy was massively popular among women. And if you wanted to read stories with female main characters that weren't just there to be like sexy warriors, you just had a bigger chance of finding that in young adult fantasy. And very interestingly, I remember back in the day, a lot of people looked down on young adult fantasy for having too much romance, because young adult fantasy tended to have more romantic plot lines than adult fantasy. So it made sense that A Court of Thorns and Roses, although pretty mature, appealed to a young adult fantasy audience, especially with its romantic focus. I would say that what we called young adult fantasy back in the day was actually just romantasy. We just didn't have the term for it. Like, the thing that people loved in young adult fantasy with its focus on romance and its female main characters, that's romantasy. That's the romantasy genre. So when a adult romantasy book like A Court of Thorns and Roses came out, people didn't have the term romantasy to refer to it, so they just marketed it as YA fantasy, even though that made no sense at all. And back in 2015, a lot of people who were big fans of young adult fantasy but were becoming adults themselves really wanted young adult fantasy books that felt a little darker or that were a little spicier. I would argue that what these people wanted were romantasy books. Romantasy has the romance and the female main character and the escapism of young adult fantasy, but it's written for adults. It's a little darker, it's a little spicier. I'm not saying that people who grew up reading young adult fantasy books cannot enjoy other like epic adult fantasy books right now. That's what I mainly read, but they are different. There's just a different vibe. Okay, my camera died, and I got a cup of tea. Let's continue. Look at my cute frog mug. My main thesis with this video is that I don't think romantasy is a new term, but it has been around in the form of young adult fantasy for a very long time. Like I said, lots of old young adult fantasy was criticized for having too much romance. And this wasn't entirely unwarranted because a lot of old young adult fantasies had romance central to its theme. Shadow and Bone is a high fantasy book that's basically also mainly a love triangle. The Lunar Chronicles are very fun young adult sci-fis. Each novel has a main romantic plot line. The Wrath and the Dawn, Cruel Beauty, all of those Beauty and the Beast retellings were basically romance books set in a fantasy setting. Romantasy books. Here's something funny I noticed. So Sarah Wendell writes for the Washington Post about romantasy. The fastest way to tell if you're looking at a romantasy is to note the title. A House of Earth and Blood, A Song of Blood and Stone. You got a romantasy. And I've seen this joke being made on TikTok as well, that like, oh, all of those romantasy books have the same title. It's all an X of X and X. And I remember back in my day, this was the joke people made about YA fantasy books, that all YA fantasy books had the same title, an X of X and X. We know that similar titling is a marketing decision made by publishers to appeal to the same audiences. So the fact that romantasy books and young adult fantasy books all had basically the same, an X of X and X title, shows that these books are being marketed to the same audience. I think a lot of people who grew up on young adult fantasy are now really enjoying adult romantasy novels, because young adult fantasy novels were basically just romantasy novels as well, just for a slightly younger audience. Wendy Logia, the VP and Senior Executive Director at Delacorte, tells Publishers Weekly that part of the romantasy audience is female readers of all ages, especially millennials, who are drawn to the comfortable safe space of young adult fiction. And a fan of A Court of Thorns and Roses said on the Financial Times podcast, romantasy felt more like part Hunger Games and Twilight, you know, Harry Potter kind of fantasy. And then actually really reminiscent of the young adult books that I used to really love and realize I don't read anymore. So like Bridge to Terabithia and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And like, it made me realize that I just really stopped reading books where magical things happened when I grew up. So yeah, I don't think romantasy is anything new. I just think that finally publishers realized that the kinds of fantasy books that they were publishing for young adults also needed to exist in the adult sphere. Now, with anything that becomes like really popular on TikTok and really popular among women, it also gets a lot of hate. And again, this is coming from someone who genuinely didn't enjoy many of the popular romantasy books. I do think like the hate from the genre, you know, it's just not surprising to me as someone who, again, has been around for a while. I'm saying that a lot in this video. I'm so sorry. I'm making myself sound so old. I've just seen people hate on these kinds of genres for a very long time. I'm just not surprised anymore. People have always looked down on romance novels, despite it being the driving force behind publishing. Here's something really interesting that I heard on the Financial Times podcast about romantasy. Romance has forever been shunned from the publishing industry, and so as a result of that, readers developed their own communities and these very strong networks. And so when publishing was going through a hard time, bookstores were struggling, romance was actually flourishing because those communities were so used to existing outside of mainstream publishing. And then social media kind of just lit that on fire, because all of a sudden the gatekeepers were gone. I like what she says about on social media, the gatekeepers are gone. On TikTok, when people share about the books that they love and the books that they read, there are no gatekeepers in the form of publishers deciding what they want to market, or literary critics deciding what they want to talk about, or what they want to read, or what they want to take serious. On TikTok, the book recommendations are fully bottom up. It comes from the readers, from the fans. A lot of people read romance, so it makes sense that a lot of people on TikTok talking about books are talking about romantic books. You're no longer reliant on publishers or literary critics to spread the word about a book. You can just upload a video about why you love the book and it can reach millions of people. So romance novels, which has been popular since forever and has had these like really tight little communities of people reading it, suddenly becomes visible to the public eye on a platform like TikTok because there are no gatekeepers. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. I just want to briefly touch on this idea that all books that are popular on TikTok, all romantasy books, are just smut. They're just spicy stories. It's a common joke that all the girlies that are suddenly reading a lot because of A Court of Thorns and Roses are just reading fairy porn, right? That's kind of a joke that people like to make, that romantasy is just spice all the way down.
All right, so I finally started reading The Fairies Who Make Boom Boom books.
What book is that?
Oh, it's so cute. It's about these two fairies and they live in this magic wood, and every night they on the table and out of him, and he and
Richard Osman on his podcast with Marina Hyde describes romantasy as follows. It's sort of fantasy. It's elves, fairies and elves and an awful lot of sex. It could almost be called fantasy rather than romantasy. And I know that people making these jokes, it's all in jest and it's not serious, but I just wanted to point out how spicy these popular romantasy books actually are. So Fourth Wing, I haven't read, but I looked it up. There's one passionate kiss scene in this entire book, and then there's 2 explicit scenes in a book that is over 400 pages. You can find outlines of all of the spicy chapters in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, and although we can see that especially the last book is just straight up super spicy, the first book especially, it's 2 chapters. There's 2 spicy scenes in an almost 500-page book. In the original A Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy, so the first 3 books, all of these books have more than 60 chapters, and there's a maximum of 4 that are spicy. And yet the entire series is often jokingly referred to as fairy porn. And I think this is giving the people who have not read this book the idea that it's just spice, that it has absolutely no plot and no fantasy. And that is, I wanted to point it out because it's just not correct. But I'm also not surprised, right? There's a reason that books that have spicy content are called smut, and that books without spice are referred to as clean romances. Spicy content is generally seen in our society as dirty, it is filth. These are commonly used euphemisms for anything that has to do with sex. But you know, I'm always talking on here on how it's good to be mindful about the language that we use and what values it reflects. The fact that we use dirty for anything that has to do with sex and then clean and pure for anything that is not that reflects a pretty old-fashioned idea that sex is something negative, something dirty, something that animals do, something of lower standing. And because it's something we look down on, a book that has a few explicit scenes becomes completely tainted. It's like those few scenes stain the rest of the story, now having the entire book being referred to as smut. In the public eye, it overshadows the fact that there's also a lot of plot here, there are characters here, there's more to the story. You don't have to like it or think it's good, but there's more to it. But instead, the entire series, the entire book is now seen as something dirty, smut. Anyway, I'm just saying, if you haven't really read romantasy books yourself, you may have this idea that these books are just porn. So I just want to point out that they're not. I mean, some of them are, but the popular ones that people are talking about, they're just not. And it is too that sometimes you cannot tell from the synopsis or the cover which way it's going to fall, which is another problem, I think. But to say that all romantasy books are just fairy porn and that the people that read them are just porn addicts is a huge overstatement and also a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happens in these books. And again, I think it's a reflection of a pretty old-fashioned idea that as soon as a book is even slightly explicit, it just ruins and brings down the entire story. Okay, that was my little side caveat. Lastly, I want to talk about the idea that romantasy books are just like more feminist fantasy books. Romantasy is often championed as feminist fantasy. It's not like those classic epic fantasy books that are very male-centric. Kathleen Farrar from Bloomsbury tells The Guardian, the genre's appeal may also be down to its bold heroines and strong yet nuanced female characters. These stories have attracted huge numbers of female readers who may previously not have felt particularly welcome or catered for in the fantasy market. Christina Clark Brown from the bookish Instagram page Nina's Nook says to The Guardian, romantasy allows women to have it all. There's no damsel who needs saving, but rather women are allowed to be powerful, go on epic quests, and find love with a partner who is an equal to them in every way. And it is true that fantasy has kind of historically always been a bit of a boys' club, but I would argue that this is not entirely true anymore, especially not in the last 10 years. There are many classic epic fantasy books that are not at all romantasy that still have really strong, bold female characters. Two of my favorites being The Fifth Season and The Poppy War, both of which have won many fantasy prizes and awards. These are really popular and acclaimed adult fantasy books, and they have strong female characters. I think to say that romantasy as a genre is like for the first time bringing strong female characters to adult fantasy, that's just ignoring all of the amazing female authors that have written amazing adult fantasy books with great strong female characters. So I just wanted to point that out. If you think that you need to go to romantasy for well-written female characters, it's not true. There's plenty of fantastic stuff out there in the epic adult fantasy side of fantasy. They are not particularly happy though. I will admit that romantasy does give a kind of perfect escapism that other epic adult fantasies tend to have a little bit less. Carrie Maniscalco, the author of the popular young adult romantasy series Kingdom of the Wicked, tells The Guardian, when you look at the global scale of what's going on socially, politically, economically, COVID, all of these things are giving readers the need to escape. I've seen kind of a trend towards more uplifting fantasy in the past few years. You know, in the 2010s, it was really popular to write grim, dark fantasy, you know, Game of Thrones style fantasy, where all the bad things under the sun were happening. All the crimes to women. It just wasn't happy. And people were just dying all the time. And now we're seeing trends like cozy fantasy. People deliberately seeking out fantasy books that don't really have a plot, and it's just people vibing in a fantasy setting. And I think the popularity of romantasy kind of fits this uplifting fantasy trend. Madison Derbyshire tells the Financial Times podcast about her first time reading ACOTAR. Because it was lockdown, I had like no attention span at all. I just found that this book, I just started tearing through it. And that was really, really nice because it was a time where you were craving such an escape. Maybe this is another reason why romantasy is just having such a huge appeal right now, because people want that escapism. I will say though, I have another contrarian point to make, sorry. To say that romantasy is all just like fun little, cutesy little escapism as compared to other epic adult fantasy is also not entirely true. I mean, A Court of Thorns and Roses is known for having extremely traumatized backstories for every single characters. A lot of these romantic stories are pretty violent. Many of these stories' main plot is that the main character has to kill like the king of another kingdom. Like there's a lot of dark stuff and violence happening in them. What do you mean they're like more cutesy and escapism than other adult fantasies? I think it's because romantasy tends to be about trauma and dark themes, but in a sensationalist way. Like I said, those books that I just mentioned, the 5th season, the Poppy War, they're also about trauma. They also have very dark themes, but you wouldn't call them like fun little escapism because they are about trauma to say something. These books have something to say about racial oppression, the horrors of war, the history between Japan and China. Whereas ACOTAR, being known for its traumatized characters, the trauma is there to kind of make you feel sad for the characters. It's trauma and dark themes for escapism, not to trigger you to think about any real world issues. And that's how you get famous lines like this: "His growls of pleasure filled the tent, drowning out the cries of the injured and crying." This is the main character and her love interest banging it out in the middle of the war, and a lot of people really made fun for this scene for how tone deaf it is. So I think that's kind of also the appeal of romantasy. It is sensationalist trauma as opposed to more introspective trauma that actually encourage you to think about something. So all in all, I think there's a lot to criticize about specific romantasy books. There's many that I don't like, but I don't think we need to hate on the genre as a whole just for having a lot of romance. And I also don't think we need to be afraid that suddenly every book is romantasy because the romantasy genre has been around for a very long time. We just didn't have the term for it. But do let me know what your thoughts on the matter are in the comments down below. I want to thank all of my patrons for continuing to support me, and a special shout out to all of my elite members whose names you can see here. Yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye!